Hello and welcome to this exclusive interview here on France 24. We're at the Paris Peace Forum and we have two guests. The first one is Christine Lagarde, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. Hello and welcome.
Thank you.
And also here, Yong Kim, the President of the World Bank Group. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Mark.
We're commemorating the end of World War I 100 years ago. Mrs. Lagarde, are you seeing any signs of the tensions that were there that caused this First World War? For instance, rising inequalities.
Yes, this is one. There are two things that I see which are strangely similar to the situation pre-First World War. One is the globalization, as we call it. Everything being the same, the volume of goods, services, the movement of people, movement of capitals, in those days was phenomenal and had grown significantly from 1870 to 1910. That's one factor, which is very strangely similar to what we have at the moment. The second one is the inequalities. Now, you will tell me that the situation was different in those days because you had the empires, you had the colonies, which created a completely different paradigm. But in terms of inequality, within certain countries, those that we call the advanced economies, that were the main not the only one, but the main actors during the First World War, there was a lot of inequality. And you certainly had the 1% and the rest. And similarly, we have a situation that is not very, very different nowadays. So, yeah.
So there are reasons to be worried, Dr. Kim. There are lots of calls for a new multilateralism, more inclusive one. I mean, is it just talk or is it something that's really needed, and how should it be done?
Well, you know, at this conference, we heard some really very interesting presentations, especially one from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And I think he said something very important. He said, you can look at these institutions and tear them down, but we will have to build them up again, and it will be much more difficult to do so. You know, our institutions came out of the post-World War II a situation in which there was recognition that we couldn't go back to the chaos of before, where, for example, in terms of our two institutions, a big concern was that currencies would the values would go up and down, there would be beggar thy neighbor policies. There had to be somewhere where we could talk about things like currency exchange rates. And then for our organization, there had to be somewhere where we could talk about what it would take to rebuild Europe, in the case of our institution. But then that grew to rebuilding so many different societies. You know, the new multilateralism is responding, I think, to something that's fundamentally different from the period of World War I, which is that new technologies are allowing everyone to see how everyone else lives. You know, within the next 5 to 10 years, everyone on Earth will have access to broadband. And when they do, everyone on Earth will be able to see how everyone else lives. And so what we're seeing right now is everyone's aspirations are going up. You know, 100 years ago, there were very few wealthy people, the royals and the people around them, and pretty much everyone else was living in extreme poverty, living off the land, barely in subsistence mode. But now you have the explosion of middle-class aspirations everywhere in the world, and so the new multilateralism is going to have to respond to this desire that everyone will have to participate fully in society. And that's a lot of what both of our organizations do, to try to create the conditions where everyone will have an opportunity to reach their aspirations. And that really wasn't what was happening between World War I and World War II. There were still huge amounts of extreme poverty in the world and very few people who actually were able to live that middle-class lifestyle.
Can I follow up
Sure.
on that? Because I totally agree with what Jim has been saying. I'll give you one example. Today, when you look at the way you operate, you have a bank account, you probably use credit cards, you might use your phone to make payment. But do you know that there are nearly 2 billion people who are not in that situation, who are financially excluded? In other words, who do not participate in any payment and who need to be integrated, who need to be part of it, who need to be able to transact, to sell their products without fear of being robbed because, you know, banknotes and money will be taken away from them, particularly the women. So what we mean by more inclusive multilateralism is making sure that everybody has the benefit of it. I'm talking from this financial perspective, but what Jim is saying is exactly that. Everybody has to benefit from it. It cannot be just for those who do the trade. It has to do with those who participate in making things, in providing services. And they have to be part of that as well. And they have to see hope as a result of that.
Right. There's also, I mean, changes in politics around the world, the rise of nationalism. The French president talked about it today, denounced it clearly, from Donald Trump to Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil, to Viktor Orban in Hungary, then the list goes on. Even in countries that are doing well or fairly well, you see this rise of my country first. This is a clear threat to you.
Well, one of the things that we all have to really face is the fact that even in the wealthiest countries in the world, there are people who did not benefit from globalization.
They're angry.
And they're angry. And we're trying to be clear about, so then what do you do about that? Do you blame it on other people? Or do you focus on what I need to do to make sure that my citizens are going to be able to compete in the economy of the future? Christine just talked about financial technology. So we actually launched together a huge agenda to include everyone in the world of the finance of the future. And in this case, it's having electronic bank accounts, having access to finance, access to markets. The fintech agenda is really, really important. But if you look at people who are like my classmates in high school, I grew up in the Midwest of Iowa, and only 10% of my graduating class went to college, and the rest got good jobs in steel mills, in factories, and they couldn't understand why we wanted to continue to go to school. Well, my classmates are now looking at a world in which they don't have the skills to compete in the digital economy of today or the future. What do? Well, those countries have to focus on things like improving their skills, but have to think about how do we change the conversation so that it's not about anger and entitlement, but it's about preparing for what is absolutely sure to come. Every thoughtful person I know says that the future will be much more digitally demanding, and everyone's got to prepare for it. And the East Asian countries are very aggressively preparing for it. I just don't think that the traditional powers of the world can sit back and think that a sense of entitlement, a sense of going backward, closing borders is going to work, given what the economy will look like in just a very short time.
Right. Speaking of the economy, obviously there are threats over global trade, especially between the U.S. and China. And in a way, I know you both were in China very recently, some see China, communist, at least officially China, communist China, as the champion of free trade versus the United States that seems to be thinking the other way. Is this what we are seeing, witnessing?
I try to be very practical. You know, there are ideological layers in all that, but practically speaking, who is doing what with whom? Everybody is doing lots of things with everybody else. And the world is vastly interconnected. Whether you call it supply chain, whether you call it interconnections, from the use of your cell phone to the products that you buy, the world is part of who you are and how you operate and what you buy. Now, what we need to be careful of is what we were talking about, including, not excluding. And to that end, we clearly need to operate within the boundaries of rules, of the respect of those rules, of acknowledgement of who has developed what. It cannot be about stealing somebody else's property, be it intellectual property. It cannot be about forcing certain principles simply because you have a big market and therefore you have to pay a special price for that. So I think what's really important is to make sure that, as Jim was saying, people receive and have access to education so that they have opportunities. That's number one. Number two, make sure that women are part of that game. When you look at the circle of leaders today, fascinating, 40 of them, 2 women. There's a little problem here that needs to be addressed. Significant problem, I would say. And third, we need to make sure that the rules are respected and that the rules that have been set by the players are evolving with time, with technologies, with the new players entering the game. If you look at our 2 organizations, they're fascinating because in the articles, there are principles that actually require us to change over the course of time, to adjust, to take new members, to increase the shares of capitals. It's not good enough, it needs to be improved, but the germs of evolutions are there and need to be helped.
Very, very quickly, I know that the bank launched a new human index capital and basically telling countries that they should do more in terms of fighting youth mortality, but also helping health and schooling and naming those countries. Is this a way to tell countries getting rich or richer is not enough?
Well, it's part of the new multilateralism, right? So if you think about the development of the past, in many ways you could say that the world went from colonialism to charity. And that worked for a while until everyone's aspirations went up. So it wasn't enough just to provide a few tokens here and there for health and education. Now we have to go on a different footing altogether. If the African countries want to compete in the economy of the future, they have to be ready their citizens have to be ready, and they're not right now. And so that's what we're pointing out. So far, we've been so focused on the generosity of the donor countries, and that's been wonderful. We've been able to tackle HIV, tuberculosis. I've worked on it myself. But what we're now saying is, look, that amount of charity is wonderful. It's necessary. We need more. But unless the leaders, ministers of finance especially, take responsibility for preparing their own citizens for the future, we're never going to get there. And we're actually now, with the ranking, having an entirely different conversation with the leaders in the developing countries. And I think they're getting it. They're understanding that there's so much more to do. And this is different. It's not about post-colonial charity anymore. It's about giving everyone an opportunity.
Just last question. 10 years ago, you witnessed firsthand the financial crisis. Are you seeing a possibility that it could happen again? Some are worried. Are you?
It's my job. I have to worry all the time. You know, we have to be mindful of potential risks and see, you know, threats on the horizons, clouds coming up. So yeah, there are clouds, of course.
Dark clouds?
The clouds are getting darker, and I think that we are trying to shout loudly that policies have to be decided, implemented, and that there is time to actually deal with those issues. But it's about time to do so and to roll up sleeves and to do it.
Can I say one thing for your audience? All of us are much less worried because Christine is in her position.
That's a nice compliment. And on this nice note, we'll end this exclusive interview with Christine Lagarde and Yong Kim from the Paris Peace Forum. Thank you very much to both of you. And thank you for watching this interview here on France 24.